Good morning. So I was hoping you'd use the other picture. I sent him a picture of a rock climber, but it was Tom Cruise, so I figured he wasn't going to use that one. I was also hoping for a bigger podium to hide behind, but let's see here. So weakness and God's power. I think Pastor Travis must have asked the elders, who's the weakest person here? And unfortunately, you're going to see I have some expertise with weakness. I want to share 3 moments when I realized that I was not in control, I didn't have what it takes, and I desperately needed God. These 3 moments involved needing a job, a sobering prognosis, and a frightening EOB, explanation of insurance benefits. In each moment, I was weak, and God stepped in big time. But first, 2 moments that happened here at Montavilla, to give you context. So 41 years ago, next month, I was standing somewhere over here, and Cindy Lou Burns came up the aisle to marry me. One of my best moments, one of my top 4, the other 3 being the births of Emily, Scott, and Megan. And this was about, I don't know how many hours after Larry and Kelly got married. They were married that same day. And then in one of my worst moments, 4.5 years ago, and I was down here with my kids, and with a very small group, because it was right after the 2 worst months for COVID deaths, and it was at Cindy's memorial service. Lymphoma, chemo, she lost her hair, and then life returned to normal for almost 4 years. Then cancer again. Bone marrow transplant, recovery, hope, and then cancer came back again. CAR T therapy, and then 4 months later, she was gone. For me, this was a time of massive weakness as I watched Cindy suffer. A time when I made 110 trips or so to OHSU, taking Cindy to countless appointments, and almost 40 of those trips to visit her in the hospital. To give an example of how I was doing, the bone marrow transplant was really brutal. It was tough to watch what she was going through. Near the end of her 23-night stay, I would come home late at night, and day after day, I would look at the growing pile of mail on my dining room table, and I couldn't even bring myself to go through it to see if there was any bills that were in danger of going past due. Fortunately, none did. But I was overwhelmed. I was totally weak. Okay, so the first 3 moments, the first of the 3 moments, it was in August of 2019. I had retired from UPS in January, and my hope was to finish my working years with a different job that had better hours, fewer hours, less stress, and then also Decembers that I could enjoy. And then amazingly, and I've only seen this once before in my time at UPS, they offered me money to leave. So, man, God was so good. And he was so good because that meant that in January I retired, and then June when cancer came back, I had 6 months to be with Cindy and to be retired. And because of that, I decided to hold off on my job search. And then cancer returned in June and totally dominated our lives, and also my attention. After chemo, she was having trouble sleeping, and so I was sleeping in the spare bedroom, and so here's the first moment. I laid down and tried to go to sleep, and it hit me. This was the time when I said I would start looking for a job. And to have a bone marrow transplant, you have to have a 24/7 caregiver, and it wouldn't be until maybe January until I could work again, maybe. And by the way, January would turn out to be 2 months before the pandemic began, so I was in trouble. I remember so clearly laying there and feeling so disturbed by this realization. I couldn't get a job. I got up, I paced, I prayed, I laid down, I tried to sleep. I got up, I paced. It was not good. I tried to figure out what I could do, and there was no possible way I could get a job. So Cindy and I started to pray together, and I cried out to God, but certainly there was no answer to this prayer. And then 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in Starbucks with a friend I hadn't seen in maybe a dozen years, and he had reached out because he wanted to offer me a job. And he had no idea what was going on. He knew I was retired, and it was a remote job. So I was able to work from home or from OHSU. Oh my goodness. I sent him an email later thanking him for the job, and he said, and this stunned me, he said, I always knew our paths would be intertwined. Okay, what? I didn't know what he was talking about, but we had worked on something 20 years before that was really a cool project, and somehow God put in his heart that idea, and it moved him to be the answer to my prayer when I desperately needed it. Think about that for a moment. Think about God's power to make that happen. My weakness, his power. And God provided for us. Okay, the second moment was the prognosis. Cancer returned the following July, so now it's the third time we've seen cancer. And we were sitting with the oncologist. He explained CAR T therapy, where they took her T cells, sent them to New Jersey, and joined with something to give them a taste for lymphoma. At this point, he said Cindy's odds of surviving were less than 50%. He explained that this was her last hope. We already knew that this wasn't good, but it was now official. For the first time, I realized Cindy might die. At that appointment, something amazing happened. I felt peace. And I mean, I felt I had the experience of peace that just stayed with me. I don't even know how to explain it, but I just constantly felt peace. And because of that peace, I was able to accept whatever was next and focus on each day. And again, my weakness, I'm going to lose Cindy potentially, and God's power. He gave me the strength for what was ahead. The FDA had approved this treatment 2 years before, and it was based on 80% viability. So when they got through with their process with her T cells, 80% of the cells still needed to be living. Her cells came back, and it was 79.7%. So what that meant was that the lab couldn't charge my insurance company $343,000, but it also meant that it was no longer an approved treatment. And so here's the third moment, the frightening EOB. About a week later, we got a statement saying that it was a small bill, like $50, and it was denied because it was no longer an approved treatment. So we were in trouble. I had read an article, a doctor at OHSU had said that to break even, they have to charge $1.5 million for this transplant, or not transplant, for the T cell. So here Cindy was losing her battle to cancer. At this point, one lung was almost shut off. Her hip had just broken from a tumor in her hip. So I freaked out. I'm thinking, what am I going to do? And for 2 hours, I struggled with it. And then I realized there's nothing I can do. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. I can't do a thing. If I was going to go broke, bankrupt, I couldn't change that. And amazingly, I was weak, and God's power worked in my heart, and unbelievably, I was able to let it go. And literally, I didn't think about it anymore, which I don't even understand at this point. But again, God's power in my weakness. More than a month later, a letter came from the insurance company, and they had reevaluated the claim, and they decided to cover it. Wow. The amazing part of the story isn't that they covered it. That was utterly amazing. But that I was able to leave it behind and just focus on what was at hand. Again, my weakness, God's power. He gave me strength for what was ahead. When cancer first returned, Cindy and I talked about God's goodness, and we realized that it was going to be harder to see God's goodness in this time. As it turned out, these 3 stories were just the most dramatic in a long list of ways that I saw God's goodness. It was the worst time in our lives, but more than ever, He was present. He was so present. Pastor Travis asked, is there something I could point to that helped me at that time, that I could also encourage you out of my experience? And I realize now that 40 years earlier, God began to prepare me for this time. I was part of a summer missions team with Artists in Christian Testimony that spent every evening in a different church in a worship service, focusing on the goodness of God. We were here, this was our last concert, was here at Montavilla, and we were downstairs, and I still remember this vividly. We were in a circle singing, God is so good, and I thought, I believe it. I got those 6 weeks, and thinking about God's goodness, hearing about it, it changed me. So in the years since, I've struggled as much as any of you to walk with God consistently. But out of that summer, I began to notice God's goodness. And again, no credit to me. I began years of meditation on God's goodness. And in cancer and into grief, I was blown away at how many times I saw God's goodness show up. Okay, so homework. If you're currently going through an incredibly tough time right now, man, I'm so sorry, having gone through something like that. And I would encourage you, look for God's goodness to show up even in small ways. For me, it made a huge, huge difference in my life. Psalm 46:1 says, He is an ever-present help in trouble. And that really summed up my experience. For the rest of you, I would encourage you to begin a practice of looking for God's goodness. Point it out to yourselves. Point it out to your spouse, your kids, your friends. Write it down. Take time to talk it over regularly with God, His goodness. So again, my weakness, God's power.